Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Sanders, and I'm a senior technical writer at Highnote. I've been working with GraphQL for 2 years, creating rich documentation experiences for developers. During my time as a technical writer, one thing has always stood out to me. Developers are only as effective as the documentation they have. And that's what we'll talk about today. Going beyond the GraphQL schema to create powerful documentation that enhances the developer experience. Let's take a look at what we'll cover today. First, we'll talk about why documentation is so important, not just as a nice to have, but as a key enabler for product success. Next, we'll look at GraphQL as a self-documenting API, both why that's a good thing, but also where it falls short. Then we'll dive into how to go beyond the schema and create truly rich developer experiences that take your API documentation from good to great. Finally, we'll have some time for questions at the end, so feel free to note down any thoughts you have as we go along. So, good documentation matters because it has a direct impact on how quickly developers can onboard and integrate with your API. Think about it. If you give someone clear, intuitive documentation, they'll be able to start using your product in days, if not hours. Good documentation also boosts API adoption. Developers are more likely to recommend an API they enjoy working with, and that starts with good docs. I've even seen docs go as far as becoming a differentiator and a selling point for platforms. Better documentation means enhanced product quality and faster innovation. With fewer barriers, developers can focus on building cool things instead of troubleshooting. Less friction means less support, which directly reduces your support costs. So, GraphQL is often hailed as a self-documenting API. That's thanks to introspection. Introspection means the API can describe itself. It allows developers to query the schema and retrieve details about available types, fields, arguments, and operations. For example, if you were to use the query that I have on the slideshow here, you would get a list of types defined in the schema. The introspection query shows the structure of the API, which makes it easy to explore. Introspection makes GraphQL a single source of truth with automatic updates as your schema evolves. Plus, it enables interactive exploration of the schema through tools like GraphQL, Apollo Studio, and GraphQL Playground. All of this happens with minimal intervention from the dev team. Long gone are the days to manually update docs every time a field changes. But to really understand how GraphQL documentation works, let's break down the core components of a schema. The schema is made up of types, which define the shape of the data. Fields represent the data available for each type. Arguments are the inputs required by certain fields, and resolvers are the functions that fetch the data. One useful feature of GraphQL is the ability to add doc strings to fields and types. So for example, I have one of the objects in the Highnote API reference up here on the slide, and you'll see that the doc strings are available for the actual type itself, so the object, and then there's doc strings available for the fields and the input objects. These descriptions, or doc strings, show up in the introspection results and in API Explorer tools, which make them visible to developers throughout development and testing. So now that we've covered the core components of a GraphQL schema, let's dive into why schema design matters, especially when it comes to delivering a seamless developer experience. A well-designed schema can make all the difference in how quickly and efficiently developers can navigate your API. Organized navigation with collapsible sections and organized by categories and domains can help streamline access to the most relevant parts of your schema, ensuring that even large complex schemas are easy to explore. Great search tools are also crucial, especially when developers need to quickly locate specific fields, types, or arguments. Clear structure is equally important. Nesting fields and arguments in a logical way ensures that developers understand relationships between data without confusion. When the schema is designed thoughtfully, it reduces the cognitive load on developers and makes their experience smoother. But the real game changer comes with integrating code snippets and tools directly into the API reference. Imagine being able to see a type, understand its purpose, and immediately interact with it through embedded code examples or even run test queries on the spot. This approach transforms static documentation into an interactive experience that speeds up learning and implementation. So to show you what I mean by all of these best practices, let's take a look at Shopify's GraphQL API reference, which in my opinion sets the gold standard for developer documentation. So here we are on the Shopify GraphQL API reference, and you might see that things look a little different than some of the GraphQL API references that you've seen. A lot of the time what I see, and honestly what High Note started at, was that we simply introspected the schema and we returned all the types, and then just there's an endless scroll of everything that follows under the category of query, mutation, object, you name it. This isn't a great experience because one, I kind of need to know what I'm looking for, and if there's an endless scroll, I could be scrolling for days. Two, things sometimes aren't named really intuitively, so even if I think I know what I'm looking for, I might not be able to find it, and the search results might not be great. So how do we improve this? What Shopify has done, I think, really solves a lot of these issues. Shopify has broken down their platform into these categories and domains. And if I click on one of these, for example, cart, you'll see that all of the queries, mutations, and objects for the cart on a Shopify store, on an e-commerce store, are under that cart domain. This means, as a developer, if I'm building my e-commerce store and I need to build the cart page or the sliding cart or whatever it might be, I know, I'm building the cart. How do I find all of the queries and mutations that I need to build that cart? Well, if I come to Shopify's API reference, I see cart and it's right there for me. We want to make these categories and domains intuitive, terms that people understand on our platform. And this just makes solving for that navigation issue so much better. Now, if I click on one of these pages, you'll see that I land on a single page. I'm not scrolling for days trying to find the information I need. Types aren't bleeding into one another with fields and arguments. Everything is on one page. We have the actual mutation itself. We have the doc strings, we have the arguments, we have the payload returns, we have everything we need on one page. And the other thing that this one-page solution gives us that I love is it gives us a really solid foundation to add really cool things to our API reference. So you'll see here on the side that that Shopify has code examples right in the API reference. So you can actually see the mutation and the input variables right here. I'm actually going to show you a better one. This one actually shows the code samples with use cases. So you can switch up the code example based on use case. Game changer. I'm obsessed with this. And then one more thing I want to show you is in the objects page. So these standalone object pages show, all the connections. It actually shows all the queries that use that object, all the mutations that use that object. It also shows you a map of fields and connections related to that object. Things like this, when we have these standalone pages for our objects and queries and mutations, allow us to build really cool things that help the developer better understand the API holistically. So, GraphQL API references, like Shopify's, really showcase the endless potential we have in building better developer experiences. This is an example of, Shopify moving beyond the traditional schema and delivering a dynamic, interactive, and highly supported API reference that is really supportive of what developers need. I'd really love to talk to you guys in the Q&A or even after the session about what GraphQL API references that you're loving right now and really what makes them great. While the schema gives us a lot of information, there are significant limitations to schema-only documentation. Only providing a schema to your developers lacks depth and doesn't provide the full context developers need to use the API effectively. So what do I mean by lack of depth? As a developer, I want real-world use cases and best practices that I can develop against. If I only have a schema, I miss out on that. Another limitation is that schema-only documentation doesn't provide implementation guidance. Developers can see that a query exists, but they might not understand the API holistically or even how to implement your product using that query that you're giving them. For example, if I have a schema that shows a mutation for create user, that's great, but what about authentication? What happens if a field is missing when I, create that mutation? These are the questions that can't be answered with just the schema. And lastly, there's still a significant learning curve with GraphQL. Many companies are just starting to adopt it, so we can't assume developers can ramp up to using it right away. We need to meet our audiences where they are, and this means providing content that helps beginners learn how to use GraphQL. So, what do developers need? They need more than just an API definition. They need tools like API explorers, they need guides and tutorials, and they need example code. They also need really good error handling guides. When something goes wrong, good documentation should not just point out the error, but suggest fixes. Let's take a deeper look at each of these solutions. Let's start with API explorers. Tools like GraphQL, Apollo Studio, and GraphQL Playground are fantastic for letting developers explore your API interactively. Integrating these tools is also pretty simple. It's as simple as installing the package for the tool you wish to use, providing an endpoint to your schema, and embedding the API Explorer directly in your docs. Embedding that API Explorer is also pretty simple. You can either use an iframe that points to your API Explorer instance, or you can design and custom develop your own branded API Explorer and point it to your schema endpoint. I'm going to show you what we do at Highnote, some things we've done for our API Explorer, and maybe you can take away some tips and tricks based off what we've done. So at Highnote, we have our GraphQL API Explorer embedded directly in our docs site. You can access it anytime you're in the docs, anytime you're in our dashboard, and it comes with a standard collection of queries and mutations. These are kind of meant for initial onboarding, implementation, testing. Basically, everything you would need to get started with the Highnote platform is here. So for example, if I wanted to create an account holder, I could come down here, create an account holder, and it fills out all this information for me. When I click Run Mutation, this executes in my test environment. If I open the dashboard side, the UI side of my test environment, I can see that this account holder was created. This is really helpful for, people that are initially testing out the platform. They can come in here, they can change any of this information if they want to use this query as the query they use in their actual integration, they can. They could also customize it. So if I'm in here and I'm typing, it has an autofill feature that will let you autofill different, fields. If you spell something wrong, it will give you an error that says cannot query field. Did you mean, and it'll show you how to fix it, which is super, super nice. It's a really great tool. Another thing that's really awesome is you can create custom collections. So when you're working with our implementations team, you can create a custom collection with the implementations team. You can create custom queries in here, so you can go to operations, create new operation, name it whatever you want, create new folders, and then you can actually search the schema from within the API Explorer. So there's a lot that you can do here. It's a really great tool. Our hope is that if you can do all your testing and learn about the platform right from within the docs, then you're staying on the platform. You don't have to, jump around to different platforms or different products for testing, and you can stay on our platform. It makes it easier, it makes implementation faster, and it helps you understand the product. Good documentation should also include getting started guides, how-to docs, and reference documentation. When you're working on, these how-to docs, focus on real-world use cases and step-by-step workflows. For example, maybe you want to create a guide that walks through a complete API call from authentication to response handling. Or maybe you want to create guides that show developers how to build their integrations or build certain features based on best practices. The options for user guides are endless, but you always want to make sure that they focus on one task at a time, they're comprehensive, and that they're actually useful for your developers' use cases. You also want to be sure to have guides that focus on troubleshooting, so if developers get stuck, they can get unstuck, whenever challenges come up. It's also a good idea to include change logs and release notes in your docs, and give your users an option to subscribe to them for updates. This will keep them informed of changes to your product. At Highnote, we actually have an API change log that is auto-updated when we change the schema in any way. It will show you fields that were added, fields that were deprecated, anything like that might pertain to your integration. We also have a product change log that informs users of experience changes or new product releases. Let's talk about code snippets. Code snippets are essential for helping developers see how to use your API in practice. They can exist alongside how-to guides that show developers how to implement a specific product or feature. My golden rules for code snippets are: they should be embedded in your docs, and they should be testable in the user's test environment. So you can embed testable code snippets directly in your documentation by integrating a testing sandbox or by using API explorers to create testing instances. I'm going to show you real quick at how we've integrated code snippets in the Highnote docs, just so you can see what this looks like in practice. Let's pretend I'm a developer using Highnote for the first time. I want to onboard an account onto the Highnote platform. I open this onboard an account guide, and you'll see all the steps that go into it, the prerequisites, everything you need. But as I scroll, you'll see these code snippets. This is pretty standard. You have a code snippet that corresponds with the step in the process. So this is create your card product. What we have here is an example mutation. This is just kind of a best practice mutation you could use. You can actually edit it right from here. So if you wanted to have, a different field or whatever you wanted to call here, you could. Again, it works like our API Explorer. It's basically an instance of our API Explorer in the docs. It'll tell you when you spell things wrong. So if I spelled this wrong, it would tell me. So when I click here on variables, this is where the magic happens. So if I wanted to create this card product, I could do it right from the docs. I don't need to open Postman. I don't need to open Apollo Studio. I don't need to open anything else. I can hit run mutation. It'll give me the response. You'll see it worked. It gave me my card product ID. Then I can rush over to the dashboard. I can look for that card product. I'm going to show you that in the dashboard super quick, just so you can see how it works. But basically, it executes it in my test environment. You'll see here, my test product. Integrating testable code snippets into your documentation takes your docs to the next level. Not only can a developer follow a guide to build something, they can build it right from the guide itself. Finally, let's talk about error handling. Good documentation helps developers troubleshoot by providing clear error messages and self-service support. For instance, You could use extensions in your GraphQL error responses to include helpful debugging information. When creating error messages, I like to think of two things: expose them and make them specific, and then also maintain a reference of them in your schema or documentation. In this case, I would recommend keeping that reference in the schema. That way it's always auto-updating. So by now, you might be wondering, all of this information is awesome, Sarah, but it seems like a lot of work. How am I supposed to maintain all these guides, code snippets, references? Well, you're in luck, because I have some really great tips for you. Maintaining high quality documentation is a continuous process. In my opinion, automation is key. Automate your schema generation and create automated testing for your docs. Remember those cool code snippets from the High-Note docs? Maintaining that many code snippets across our docs is a lot of overhead. But to automate things, here at High-Note, we implemented smoke tests that validate every code snippet against our schema. And we also have a webhook that triggers a Slack bot that tells me when a code snippet fails testing. We went from having 9% of our code snippets being invalid at any given time to having 99.99% of them valid at any given time. I would love to say 100%, but when there's humans involved at any degree, we have to be a little realistic. But 99.99% of the time, way better than 91% of the time. My next point is collaboration and feedback. Feedback is crucial to maintain quality docs. Create feedback mechanisms for external developers using your docs, as well as internal teams that work with the docs or work alongside onboarding customers. Some suggestions I have are integrate some article voting and article commenting. If you're open source, you could also have your community contribute to your docs. There's also, you can do internal surveys, survey different teams. And one of my favorites is internal workshops and focus groups. I love to get people across the entire company, across, different orgs, and get them in a room together for a few hours, maybe a day, maybe 2 days, whatever it might be, and pick their brains, see what's working, see what's not working. Set aside that time and you'll get a lot of value out of that. And lastly, I am a proponent for the docs as code approach. If you're writing documentation in the same environment as your internal development teams, you are working alongside of them. You are working in the environment they're working in. It makes collaboration easier. And you can also update docs alongside your code base as it evolves and updates. Docs are usually stored as markdown files in your version control system, so it helps with updating, in tandem with your code base. So to wrap things up, we've seen that GraphQL's introspective nature offers great self-documentation, but that's really only the beginning. Relying solely on the schema for documentation limits the depth of knowledge developers need to truly excel. It's not just about listing fields or types, it's about providing an intuitive, engaging experience that empowers your developers to confidently use your API. Going beyond the schema allows you to deliver a comprehensive developer experience, one that minimizes friction and accelerates adoption. API explorers foster hands-on discovery. Tutorials and how-to guides offer step-by-step pathways to success, and well-structured code snippets ensure developers can immediately implement what they've learned. Plus, robust error handling drastically reduces frustration, which turns issues into opportunities for learning. Ultimately, investing in rich, well-rounded API documentation isn't just about better developer experiences, it drives long-term business success. It reduces onboarding time, it increases developer retention, it decreases support costs, and it boosts the adoption of your API. It's a win-win for both developers and your organization. So as you leave here today, think about the documentation you provide as a core part of your API strategy. Don't just think in terms of fields and queries, think in terms of experiences. How can you empower developers to go beyond using your API and become true advocates for it? With that, thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have here today.
Welcome, Sarah, to the Write the Docs Q&A. It's so good to see you. We have a ton of questions. People just loved your talk, and we've got so many things that they wanted to ask you.
Awesome.
So the first thing is your Docs team in charge of API governance? Meaning, do they create rules for new API components, naming, enforce the standards? We would like this to be true. Is it true for you?
So the Docs team does sit on the API design committee. So we are, involved in the API governance. We are involved in naming. When I first joined Highnote, we weren't, and there was a lot of messiness with naming and inconsistencies across the API. But since then, we've adopted an approach to really pull docs in and have a big voice in that room. A lot of it is naming and even approving PRs with doc strings and stuff like that.
Oh, that's excellent. That's really good to hear. That's a nice trend in your company.
Yes.
So here's another question. Are your documentarians the key people who are designing the schemas? It's a good one.
So again, we're involved in the schema design. We sit on that committee, but usually the schema comes to that committee already kind of it has taken shape. So our developers pretty early on are designing the schema along with we have some API platform members on our DevX team that also are very heavily involved in that. Most of the designing of the schema that Docs plays a role in is like I said before, the naming and consistencies across the schema.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So more that kind of oversight. Here's another one. Have you always used GraphQL or did you migrate from REST? If you migrated, how did that go?
I did migrate from REST. So I came to Highnote having never used GraphQL, but I had a very good understanding of REST. And there was a learning curve for me. So when I started really putting a lot of love into our GraphQL docs, I had a really unique lens of being that person that I was almost writing for, someone that had the learning curve that they had to get over. There's a lot of really great resources out there from the GraphQL Foundation. Apollo has really great learning resources. And if you understand REST, it's easier to ease into GraphQL. So if you already have a really good understanding of REST, it isn't too much of a learning curve.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know. It's good to understand that relationship.
Yeah.
And what is the best approach to documenting your first GraphQL API?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm someone who needs to really use a product and test a product before I go about documenting that product. So for me, being new to GraphQL, I went through, my collections in Insomnia, which was the platform I was using before we had our integrated code snippet testing and our API Explorer, and just actually using the product and seeing how the data flowed, making, queries and mutations in my test environment. So
Okay.
I'm always an advocate for getting your hands dirty, using the product, testing as much as possible.
And here I thought when you said insomnia, I was afraid the transition was giving you insomnia, but no.
Oh, no.
I had a moment there.
It's like a similar tool to Postman.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Are the code examples and extras part of the API or are they added just for the documentation? Now, this is an interesting question.
So they are added just for the documentation. So how the code samples work is, when a engineer is giving me a pretty early draft and I'm working with them on a draft for a guide, they'll provide some best practice code samples based off of the schema that
Mhm.
they designed. And they'll say, this is our intended use case for this schema. This is a good, almost like a template boilerplate for a developer to use. We work through it, test it, make sure it makes sense. And then those get added to our docs through our CMS, which we use HighGraph.
Mhm.
And from there, they go through like testing and stuff to make sure they work and they're accurate and up to date. But yeah, those are kind of manually crafted for our users with a good understanding of their use cases.
That actually sounds really great.
Yeah.
What kind of docs engineering support did you need to implement the API Explorer in the docs?
The API Explorer is actually a lot easier to implement than you would think. So it's basically an instance of Apollo Studio, which is a platform
Mhm.
for GraphQL that allows you to introspect your schema and then gives you an environment to almost like a playground environment to explore your schema. To make that API Explorer, you basically get the endpoint for your Apollo Studio instance. And then I worked with our developer experience team and our front end engineers to uh, design the front end of that experience. But it's basically just talking to
Okay.
the endpoint of your Apollo Studio instance.
Mm, okay. Oh, great. Do you know how they implemented the live queries in the docs? And that would be a dream for me, says this person. This is from Matt Dawson in the chat. So he apparently wants this.
So when you say the live queries, is that the autocomplete in the code snippets, like within the guides?
It might be that he may have to add something in chat for us
Okay. Because
because I'm not.
if it's that, the code snippets are actually another instance of our Apollo Studio. So it's actually like one of those queries or mutations that are in those default collections we provide. The code samples in the docs are an instance of Apollo Studio that allows us to um, provide that code sample on the front end and have the same capabilities that our API Explorer has. It's another way to think of it as like an embedded API Explorer.
Okay. Matt has clarified, and he says it looked like you had a try it button. Maybe I misunderstood.
Oh, yeah, there is a button where you can execute that code sample in your test environment, and it allows for that live feedback to like gives you the response. You can open the UI and see that action is executed. But yeah, that's an embedded instance of our API Explorer. So it's basically just like a simpler version of the API Explorer embedded right in the docs.
Oh, okay. Excellent. We've got one final question. Can GraphQL be used on most or all code bases, or is it only for a certain set? That's
Um, so GraphQL can be used for anything. I actually just got back from GraphQL Conf and seen all the different ways that people are using GraphQL. You can, put it actually on top of a REST API. You
okay.
can, have an entire GraphQL API. You can use it just internally for like internal tooling. There's a lot of ways to use it, but the benefit of GraphQL is that you have a single endpoint that your users are calling to fetch or manipulate data versus REST, you have a lot of endpoints. And with GraphQL,
Mm,
because you have one endpoint, you can write very specific queries
mm.
that fetch data. So you can build very flexible, kind of like endless possibilities and solutions. It gives the developer a lot of flexibility.
Oh, okay. That's nice. That's nice to know. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. This has been a fascinating talk. People are just giving you all kinds of kudos in chat, all kinds of
Thank
love
you.
emojis over here. They love what you did. I think that this is pretty much wrapping it up for the day. This is our last talk, and we want to just thank everybody for a great Write the Docs. And I thank you very much, Sarah, for bringing us home today.
Of course. Thank you for
Ending
having
us
me.
on such a high note. You've really ended it with a
Love
lot of
that.
fun. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody.